Leanne and April, I'm trying to study for this up and coming final, and I'm struggling on the membrane transport material. Can you help me out?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to help out. Membrane transport is one of the most important topics that we've learned thus far. Without proper membrane transport in the body, most of our everyday human functions would cease to exist.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that important. I know there are many forms of membrane transport that may or may not require energy or other factors to fully function.
With there being so many different forms of membrane transport, are you able to walk us through them? Because they can be confusing.
Yeah, for sure. They can be super confusing. Leanne and I can break down the different forms of membrane transport for you in the simplest way possible so you can be ready for exams. To start off, we should define what a concentration gradient is, as well as the difference between active and passive transport. A concentration gradient is the difference in the concentration of a substance between two areas.
Gosh, I'm going to have to put a lot of my own concentration to understand this gradient stuff, huh?
Ha ha ha. Good one, Michaela. Now, with that being said, we can now distinguish active and passive transport.
I know this. Isn't passive transport a form of transportation where all molecules move down their concentration gradients without the use of ATP?
So would active transport be the movement across a membrane against a concentration gradient through the use of ATP?
Yes, however, it normally requires the help of a protein carrier and cleaves ATP to use it as energy.
Okay, things are starting to make a little bit of sense. Can you go into a little bit more detail on the different types of passive transport?
Yeah, of course. Here are some pictures if you get confused. So there are a few different levels of passive transport, including facilitated diffusion, simple diffusion, and osmosis.
Simple diffusion is one of the main forms of passive transport. Simple diffusion uses ungated ion channels, channel proteins, and this includes nonpolar molecules that diffuse directly across the membrane.
I believe lipid soluble molecules go directly through the membrane, and hydrophilic molecules are transported through an open protein channel.
Wow, that doesn't seem so simple to me as the name would indicate.
Yeah, but it is definitely more simple than active transport. Just wait till we go over that. Not to mention how all of them use a lot of concentration in terms of their gradient movements.
Okay, back to the topic at hand. Facilitated diffusion is another form of passive transport and it uses a carrier protein. The carrier protein opens on the outside of the cell to let a molecule in and then closes behind it and simultaneously opens on the inside of the cell to let the molecule fully come in.
I also believe that facilitated diffusion maximizes at a lower rate of diffusion compared to simple diffusion. This is because of the opening and closing that occurs in the carrier protein.
The last type of passive transport is osmosis. It deals specifically with the movement and concentration gradients of water, specifically using aquaporins, which are a type of channel protein.
Osmosis occurs from pure water toward a water/salt solution, allowing the water to move down its concentration gradient.
So in simple terms, does the salt attract the water to one side?
No, that is actually a common misconception. In reality, sodium displaces the water, causing the water to want to be at equilibrium and move across the membrane.
Typically, the side with more salt particles would have a higher water level, as shown in the image, because more salt particles on one side results in more water particles on the opposite side, causing the water to want to shift towards the salt particle side to resume balance.
So if I were to sleep with a textbook as a pillow, would the knowledge osmositize or travel into my brain via osmosis? Because that would be super cool.
No, I wish, but sadly, osmosis occurs only in a liquid medium. Also, viewer discretion, osmositize is not a real word.
To add on a little more, I think that aquaporins are a very important type of channel protein to mention in this section. Aquaporins aid in osmosis as they are channel proteins that only move water in and out of the cell.
Okay, so now with my understanding of passive transport and all of its parts, I think I'm ready to go through active transport.
To start, we have two different types of active transport.
I know. Primary active transport and secondary active transport.
Yes, Rochelle, thank you. Primary active transport consists of molecules being pumped against an electrochemical gradient at the expense of energy, ATP, importantly known as a direct use of energy.
Secondary active transport, on the other hand, is driven by energy stored in the electrochemical gradient of another molecule, usually sodium. The indirect use of energy is provided by primary active transport.
So, if active transport and passive transport were in a bodybuilding contest, who would win?
Oh no, who would?
Active transport from using so much ATP and pumping them ions.
Bro,
Okay, so moving on. Just to solidify the idea of active transport, let's go over some examples of primary and secondary active transport. We can start with primary active transport.
3 examples of primary active transport are sodium potassium ATPase, calcium ATPase, and proton or H plus ATPase. Sodium potassium ATPase is particularly interesting because it is an antiporter that aids in many mechanisms and polarizations of the cell membrane.
So what Leanne is saying is that the sodium potassium pump is an antiporter that pumps 3 sodium ions out of the cell and 2 potassium ions into the cell against their gradient. This form of pumping creates a negative electrical charge inside the cell.
When this charge is created, the membrane can be polarized and create an action potential, which can lead to many reactions along the cell membrane.
gosh, primary active transport sounds super salty to me.
I know, right? As for an example of a secondary active transport, antiporters and symporters are the most common form of this kind of transport.
Antiporters transport a substance in the opposite direction of a driver ion, like sodium. Since sodium is pumped outside the cell thanks to the sodium-potassium pump, this same exact sodium is used as the driver ion in secondary active transport to move other ions in a certain direction, thus indirectly using ATP.
Sounds like a traffic jam to me. Am I right? Vroom vroom skirt.
So a symporter is exactly opposite that of an antiporter. It transports substances in the same direction as the driver ion, like sodium.
Primary active transport can be an antiporter too, but they are labeled primary when they cleave ATP, whereas secondary uses it indirectly through driver ions.
Obviously, all of these types of transportation, both active and passive, occur on the cell membrane. This is super important to cells as is the gatekeeper of what comes in and what goes out.
I mean, we wouldn't want the coronavirus and other pathogens just mosey on over into our cells and harm us, would we?
No, not at all. So to help in being a gatekeeper, our cell membranes have 2 main types of proteins, peripheral and integral proteins.
So would you say that the gatekeeper is almost like the bouncer at a club?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, back to the subject at hand. Aren't peripheral proteins located along the outer part of the lipid bilayer? And these types of proteins include enzymes and intracellular signal mediators, right?
Yeah, that's right. And integral proteins are located throughout the entire lipid bilayer and open up to both the inside and outside of the cell, unlike peripheral proteins that are only opened up or exposed to one side of the cell membrane.
Examples of integral proteins include channels, pores, carriers, and other enzymes.
As we mentioned earlier, we do have both carrier and channel proteins in types of passive transport. However, in both primary and secondary active transport, only carrier proteins are used.
So when it comes to ion channels in passive transport, both ungated and gated ion channels are used.
To be more specific, I think simple diffusion uses ungated channels as they are always open and allow certain uncharged particles to freely flow through. And facilitated diffusion uses gated ion channels as they only open in certain charged molecules.
And then when it comes to all forms of active transport, only gated ion channels are used. But yeah, That's about all we've got for an explanation.
I hope this makes more sense to you now. It can all seem quite complicated at the start.
Yeah, some of the stuff that was confusing at the start is now much more clear to me.
Thank you so much for explaining it all.
Now it's time for your quiz.
Wait, what? A quiz?
Yeah, we need to make sure you have all the information solidified in that good old noggin of yours.
So what is a,
Osmosis!
no, it's what is a concentration gradient?
I think it's the difference in concentration between two substances.
That's great. What are the different types of transports?
Passive and active, but also osmosis!
Yes, technically osmosis is a form of active transport, but you are correct. What is a major difference between active and passive transport?
Passive doesn't use ATP, but active does.
That's awesome. I think you guys know a lot more now than when we started. Your exam should be as easy as oxygen diffusing across the membrane via
Full diffusion!
Yes, good job. Good luck, you guys.
Thank you for watching. Bye.